At 9:18 a.m. on October 14, 1943, Lieutenant Pilot Jack Reaves leaned forward in the cockpit of his P-47 Thunderbolt at 26,000 feet above Schweinfurt, Germany, watching the formation of B-17 flying fortresses below preparing for their bombing run on the ball-bearing factory, a target considered the lifeblood of Nazi Germany's war industry. Reaves was only 24 years old and had completed 12 escort missions, but he had never once stayed with the bomber formation until they returned home. It wasn't because he lacked courage, but simply because his P-47 couldn't fly far enough. The fuel gauge in front of him was dropping fast. The main tank had only 12 minutes of flight left. By orders, when they reached that limit, the entire escort squadron had to turn back, leaving hundreds of heavy unprotected bombers behind. Reaves gripped the control stick, watched the oil pressure needle tremble slightly, and sighed, 10 more minutes. To his left, 3 other P-47s began banking away to withdraw. Ahead, the B-17 formation pressed steadfastly deeper into German territory by another 200 miles. No one on the radio frequency said a word. Everyone knew what would happen next. As Reaves and the escort formation vanished from radar, the Luftwaffe appeared, groups of Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s diving from high altitude, slicing through the bomber formation like black knives in a gray sky. In 15 minutes, 60 B-17s were shot down, over 600 crew members missing. The afternoon report was terse, escort range insufficient. When he landed back at Debden Base in England, Reaves walked into the operations room and looked up at the map covered with hundreds of red pins across central Germany, each pin representing a plane that didn't return. In the corner of the room, Technical Officer Alan Phelps looked up, his eyes weary. Both understood the problem wasn't courage, but range, a limit of fuel and metal. That day, the Air Force called it Black Thursday. But from that dark day, in the mind of a young pilot, a question began to form, a question everyone would call stupid, but which would later end the Luftwaffe's dominance over Europe's skies. In 1943, the P-47 Thunderbolt was considered the pride of the U.S. Air Force, the largest, heaviest, and most powerful fighter ever built. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double WASP 18-cylinder engine produced 2,000 horsepower, enough to take the plane to 30,000 feet and speeds over 400 miles per hour. In theory, it was the perfect machine for air warfare, armored, stable, heavily armed. But beneath that steel skin lay a fatal limitation: fuel. At cruising power, the engine consumed 250 gallons per hour, and the P-47's main tank held only 305 gallons, equaling 75 minutes of useful flight. In combat conditions, when pilots had to increase power, that time dropped to just over an hour. From England to Berlin was nearly 500 miles, double the maximum range. The numbers didn't lie. They were the mathematics of death. In the engineering room at Debden, Captain Alan Phelps, 29 years old, the officer in charge of fuel performance, stared at the statistics in front of him. In theory, everything was up to spec. Pressure curves, compression ratios, combustion efficiency, all values within Republic Aviation's factory standards. Yet the real-world results were disastrous. P-47 squadrons had never escorted a B-17 formation past Berlin's borders. At Schweinfurt or Regensburg, they had to turn back. When the escorts withdrew, the flying fortresses became easy prey for the Luftwaffe. In 3 months, over 400 crew members were missing. Technical command in Washington called it the physical limit of straight-wing aircraft. But Phelps knew the problem wasn't physics, but fuel system design. He pulled out Republic's old blueprint, marked Auxiliary Fuel System, Revision 2. In the engineer's notes, a scrawled line stood out: rejected, risk of vapor lock and backfire. Engineers had tried installing belly-mounted drop tanks to extend range, but failed. At high altitude, thin air caused lower pressure in the auxiliary tank than in the engine's intake. When the pilot opened the suction valve, the fuel-air mixture was sucked backward, creating vapor lock choking. The engine shook violently, combustion chambers mixed wrong ratios, and one spark could make the plane explode. Test reports described it clearly. Fuel feed unstable beyond 18,000 foot, fire hazard confirmed. Those experiments made the drop tank idea dangerous, impractical. Superiors concluded, better to lose bombers than fighters in flames. Reaves, leaning against the doorframe, listened in silence. He looked at the torn blueprints and said softly, "So we just accept that distance decides who dies?" Phelps didn't answer right away. He just tapped his pen on the 250 in the stats. "This is physics, Jack. 1 gallon per 1.5 miles. No miracle changes that." Reaves frowned. "It's not physics," he said. "It's fuel." That simple statement silenced the room. Phelps looked up. "What did you say?" "We don't need a new airplane," Reaves replied. "We just need more fuel. Hang a tank under the wing. Run a line into the main feed. Control it manually. When it's empty, drop it." He said it decisively, then sketched a small cylinder with a connecting pipe in grease pencil. Another engineer laughed. "You'd blow yourself up before Berlin, Lieutenant." Someone else added, "We tried. Vapor lock kills engines. 2 test pilots burned alive." Phelps froze, studying the sketch closely. He pulled up a chair, added a few lines. The problem wasn't the tank. It was the venting system. They used rigid aluminum lines. At altitude, pressure difference builds up, and the return air can't escape. That's what caused the vapor lock. He drew a small arrow to a vent pipe. If we use flexible copper tubing and add a bleed valve to equalize pressure, vapor can't form. The feed will stay steady. Reaves looked at him. "You think that's enough?" Phelps nodded slightly. "It's enough to try." He looked up at the P-47 in the fading light. Outside, sunlight gleamed off the metal fuselage onto the ceiling. "The brass will call it stupid," Phelps said, "but if it keeps those bombers alive, I'll take stupid." In the corner, Reaves tore off the paper and stuffed it into his flight jacket pocket. 2 men, an engineer and a pilot, had just sketched a solution everyone thought was insane. But amid the smell of oil and metal, they both understood one thing: to change this war, sometimes all it took was a tank hung under the wing. 3 days later, cold rain blanketed Debden base. The P-47s returned streaked with black smoke, wings riddled with bullet holes. In the mess hall, pilots sat silently around scratched steel tables. At the far end, 3 tables were completely empty, trays of food still in place from morning. No one touched them. The mess manager quietly cleared them away. No need to ask. They weren't coming back. The casualty board on the wall had just been updated. 45 bombers missing. Each line was a crew. 10 men, 10 families. No one spoke loudly, but a young pilot in the corner muttered wearily, "We're just sending men out to die slower." No one reacted, because everyone knew he was right. Reaves sat by the window, a cold cup of coffee in front of him. His flight jacket still smelled of oil, eyes sunken from lack of sleep. On the table was a crumpled letter, in the slender, slanted handwriting of Evelyn, the wife of his flight school classmate, Lieutenant Joe Kramer, a P-47 pilot from the neighboring squadron, missing the previous week while escorting bombers back from Leipzig. Reaves opened the letter and read it for the 5th time. "They say Joe ran out of fuel before crossing the coast. Is that true? He always said the P-47's range was too short. Please tell me it's not." He set the letter down, hand trembling slightly. He wanted to write back, to lie that it was engine trouble, an accident, anything but the truth, but he couldn't. Joe had died exactly as the daily fuel charts predicted. 20 more miles, and he might have lived. 1 more tank, and he could have come home. In the engineering room, Phelps was quietly crossing out a line in the squadron roster, changing active to missing. Every day, the list grew longer. Smiling faces in group photos now became marks on paper. No one mentioned fuel consumption anymore, because every calculation led to the same conclusion. Death was built into the design. Night fell, engines roared on the runway as new missions took off, and everyone knew tomorrow there would be more empty tables in the mess. Reaves sat alone in the equipment room staring at the scribbled drop tank sketch he and Phelps had drawn. In the dim light, the pencil lines curved like a reminder. If the fighters couldn't fly far enough, those flying fortresses would never have a chance to return. And then, war was no longer a matter of engineering. It was a matter of human lives. That night, cold winds swept the debonair runway, carrying the smell of burned oil and gunpowder. In the hangar, only a dim yellow light spilled from a hanging lamp high above. Captain Alan Phelps and Lieutenant Jack Reaves, hunched beside the frame of an old P-47, in front of them 2 fuel tanks, salvaged from a B-17 shot down the previous week. Their aluminum shells were dented, weld seams cracked, still stained with charred paint. "We'll die because of this," Phelps said, half joking, half serious. Reaves replied, "No worse than dying from running out of gas." They began welding the tank bodies with a handheld torch, sparks flying and falling onto the oil-stained concrete floor, hot metal mixed with the sharp, acrid smell of gasoline. When finished, they fitted temporary copper lines connecting from the tank to the right wing of the P-47, then attached a valve scavenged from an army truck. The valve didn't fit perfectly. Phelps secured it with steel clamps. After 3 hours of struggle, amid the small pops of cooling metal, something new took shape. A 75-gallon auxiliary tank crudely hung under the right wing, looking awkward like a mismatched part. Reaves held the torch, stepped back to admire it, and said softly, "Berlin Express." Phelps looked over and chuckled. "What the hell makes you think it'll fly?" "Faith," Reaves answered, "and a lot of stupidity." Footsteps echoed behind them. A gravelly voice from the squadron commander rang out. "What the hell is this?" They turned. Major Collins, the squadron leader, stood in the hangar door, eyes fixed on the thing hanging under the wing. "That's unauthorized modification, Lieutenant," he barked. Reaves stood straight, wiping sweat with his sleeve, and replied without hesitation, "So was flying without fuel, sir." The room fell silent. Collins stared at them for a moment, eyes mixing anger and exhaustion. He turned and walked away, saying coldly, "If anyone asks, I didn't see this." As his bootsteps faded beyond the door, Phelps exhaled. "We just broke military law," he said. Reaves replied, "Well, at least this time the law was worth breaking." Phelps sat at the table, opened the technical inspection log, quickly wrote a few fake lines, and signed his name. Inspection complete. No irregularities. He closed the log and looked up at the P-47 standing silent in the dim light. Under the right wing, the auxiliary tank reflected the lamp's golden glow, like an unnamed piece of metal awaiting its trial by fire. Phelps said quietly, "It's ugly." Reaves shrugged. "Ugly, stupid." He paused, staring long. "Maybe brilliant." Both fell silent. Outside, the night squadron's engines faded into the distance. In the hangar, only 2 men remained with a crazy idea. A rough, hand-welded fuel tank that could explode at any moment, but might also bring those B-17s home. Early morning on December 3rd, 1943, a thin fog covered Debden's skies. No one noticed as P-47 Thunderbolt serial number 276421 taxied to the runway, its Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine rumbling softly in the mist. Reaves had logged it in the flight book as engine test, post-maintenance engine check, a valid enough reason to take off without questions. Under his right wing, the 75-gallon handmade auxiliary tank dangled, reflecting the faint winter morning light. In the control tower, Phelps watched through binoculars, heart pounding. If anything went wrong, that plane could explode in midair. Reaves pushed the throttle. The Thunderbolt shuddered and surged forward. The speed needle climbed past 150 miles, 200, then 250. As the wheels left the runway, he heard wind whistling around the cockpit glass, weak sunlight glinting off the pale gray aluminum wings. At 12,000 feet, everything was normal. Engine steady, oil pressure stable. Reaves turned north, flying over the North Sea, avoiding Luftwaffe patrol routes. 2 hours later, the main fuel gauge dropped to red. He took a deep breath, glanced at the temporary switch on the left of the panel, the valve for auxiliary fuel. "Here goes nothing," he said softly, then turned the valve. In the first moment, nothing happened. Then the fuel pressure needle rose. The engine didn't stall, didn't shake, no choking. The familiar growl of the Pratt & Whitney stayed steady like a heartbeat. Reaves checked the pressure. Stable at 38 psi. He laughed in the cockpit. "You beautiful idiot. It works." He kept flying, crossing the Dutch coast toward Kassel, deep in German territory, farther than any P-47 had ever gone. On radio, no one called him. Everyone thought he was testing engines in safe airspace. At 25,000 feet, the sky deep blue, ground just gray patches below, the auxiliary tank fed fuel steadily. When the panel gauge read empty, he performed the final action, dropping the tank. Reaves pulled the release, felt the plane lighten. Through the rearview mirror, he saw the metal tank detach, spin a few times, then fall into the sea. No fire, no explosion. A small flash gleamed and vanished. He keyed the radio, laughing to himself. Berlin Express just made it to Germany. He turned back, flying another 2 hours west. Landing at Debden, total flight time was 5 hours 3 minutes, double the Thunderbolt's normal limit. The plane slid down the runway, touching down safely. Phelps ran over, but before he could speak, 2 military police officers stepped out to block them. "Lieutenant Jack Reaves," one said, "you're under investigation for unauthorized modification of an aircraft fuel system." They confiscated the logbook, sealed the plane, and took Reaves to interrogation. The preliminary report was cold. Unauthorized field modification of fuel system, possible violation of Air Corps Maintenance Protocol 42B. Phelps stood outside the door, peering through the frosted glass, seeing Reaves calm, eyes glowing with quiet satisfaction. He knew what had happened out there. Not a stupid experiment, not a reckless stunt. It was proof a handmade fuel tank, a few copper tubes, and a truck valve had let a P-47 fly twice as far as any technical spec. As Reaves was escorted out, Phelps caught his eye. No words needed. Both knew they had just rewritten history with cheap metal. 3 weeks later, as early winter winds swept through Debden, Reaves was released from temporary detention. No disciplinary record, no apology, just a dry sheet. Released pending further review. The whole base knew Phelps had intervened. He quietly erased traces, filed fake fuel system reports, stashed the remaining tank in the spare parts shed. That night, the two sat at a metal table amid oil smells and wind howling outside the hangar. "We proved it," Reaves said, voice hoarse. "Now we need to prove it again, under German guns." Phelps looked up, expression serious. "You mean tested in combat?" Reaves nodded. "Just once. If it works while being shot at, no one can call it stupid anymore." They chose the Magdeburg mission on December 22, a target deep in German territory, nearly 480 miles from Debden. Phelps and Reaves worked 2 straight nights, welding 3 more 75-gallon auxiliary tanks, attaching them to the wings of 3 other P-47s. The volunteer pilots were Lieutenant Brooks, Sergeant Kane, and Captain Dwyer. Men tired of turning back midway, leaving comrades to be shot down. During final checks, Phelps whispered, "If anything goes wrong, all 4 of you will blow up." Reaves smiled. "Well, at least we'll blow up in the right place." The next morning, skies gloomy with thick clouds. On the runway, 4 P-47s with auxiliary tanks hung under wings, looking heavier and bulkier than usual. The inspecting engineer glanced over and frowned, but said nothing. Perhaps he too understood this war had no room for useless rules. At 0910, the formation took off. They joined the B-17s heading east, crossing the North Sea in silence. At 24,000 feet, clouds thinned, sunlight glaring off shining metal fuselages. 2 hours in, as other escort squadrons began turning back, Reaves held course. "Fuel check," he said over radio. "Gauge reads half," Brooks replied. "Still feeding from auxiliary." Everyone fell silent, knowing what it meant. They were flying deeper than any P-47 ever had. Over Magdeburg, the familiar scene repeated. Small black dots in the sky. Messerschmitt 109s diving on the bombers. Behind, other escorts had turned home, but the 4 Thunderbolts were still there. Reaves lowered his sun visor, pushed the throttle. "Brake right, cover the forts." He pulled a tight turn. M2 Browning machine guns roaring. Tracer rounds drew bright lines across the gray sky. 109 exploded, black smoke spiraling. Ground flak boomed, but the 4 P-47s held firm around the B-17 formation like a moving shield. They stayed in position for 17 minutes, downing 3 enemy planes and scattering the entire attack wave. As the bombers dropped their loads and withdrew, Reaves checked fuel one last time. The main tank still had a quarter. They escorted all the way to the Dutch border, while other P-47s had left the fight over half an hour earlier. When the last B-17 crossed the North Sea, not one was lost in withdrawal. The after-action report was brief. 0 bombers lost in withdrawal. Landing back at Debden, Reaves and the 3 others stepped down from their planes, flight jackets blackened with smoke and gunpowder dust. Major Collins, squadron commander, approached, eyeing the still-fueled gauges. "How the hell did you still have fuel?" he asked. Reeves smiled wearily, voice raspy. "We made some." Collins was silent a moment, then nodded, said nothing more, just waved them off. That night, in the dim maintenance bay, Phelps opened the empty auxiliary tank's cap, lightly touching the cold metal. Oil lamp light gleamed on ugly welds and wind scratches. On the gray surface, someone had chiseled crooked letters. Stupid idea, but it worked. Phelps smiled, said nothing. He knew that moment had changed everything. A banned experiment, a handmade fuel tank, and 4 pilots who dared fly beyond any regulation. After the Magdeburg mission, everything at Debden changed without anyone needing to say it. The 4 P-47s returned intact, and the B-17 formation lost not a single plane. No orders, no commendations, but the entire base heard about the Berlin Express. In the maintenance bay, mechanics crowded around the Thunderbolt with its ugly welds under the wing. They couldn't believe it had flown double the design limit. Captain Phelps just smiled and showed them the oil-stained paper with the feed line diagram he and Reeves had sketched. Just flexible copper tubing, a manual valve, and "don't let the brass know." The first copies were scribbled on Lucky Strike cigarette pack wrappers, passed hand to hand through the tech crews. No signatures, no reports. In 2 weeks, 40 P-47s at Debden and nearby bases had auxiliary fuel tanks attached. Each one slightly different, some round, some oval, welded from old oil drums or even industrial cooking pots. The mechanics jokingly called it flying with garbage cans. But those garbage cans changed the war. Pilots returning from Leipzig said their fuel gauges still had gas when they crossed the coast. People began to believe the P-47, once mocked as a flying brick, could now escort entire bomber formations across Germany. As casualty numbers dropped, rumors spread faster than any report. At Duxford, a young engineer with the 56th Fighter Group received Phelps's hand sketch and copied it onto an ammo box lid. A week later, his P-47s were carrying auxiliary tanks too. In the shelters, men whispered instructions on valve connections, how to check pressure by ear instead of gauges. Sometimes they argued about mounting angles, release pins, but all agreed on one thing: it worked. By January 1944, the secret escaped Debden. A 4th Fighter Group pilot transferred to Mustang testing brought a smudged sheet with the note, "Copper tube plus bleed valve, safe feed." P-51 engineers read it, tried it, and 3 days later the first Mustangs with handmade drop tanks flew trials over the North Sea. Nothing was recorded, no Lockheed or Republic technical manual. It all happened in the dark, like a silent ritual among mechanics and pilots, who believed that waiting for orders meant more men would die. In the mess hall, they told stories of Reeves's detention and release, Phelps forging signatures to protect his friend, Major Collins pretending not to see planes taking off with garbage cans, and in every telling, the voice carried a little more pride, a little more admiration. No heroes, just tired men trying to fix a system failure with bare hands and scrap copper. A month later, new P-51 squadrons were deployed officially. When the first Mustangs took off with auxiliary tanks, someone joked over the radio, "Berlin or bust," but no one laughed. They knew it was no longer a joke. That day, B-17s were escorted all the way to Leipzig, then Berlin farther than any previous mission. On tactical maps, new routes were drawn in red ink, longer, deeper, like flames spreading through the night. And though no one admitted it, everyone understood. That secret was burning bright, smoldering, but unstoppable. By January 1944, the first signs of change appeared not in England, but in Luftwaffe intelligence reports. A cold typewriter line read, "American fighters remain over targets longer than before." German intelligence officers didn't understand what was happening. For over 2 years, their tactic had been the same: wait until U.S. escorts reached range limits, then launch fighters against the lone B-17s withdrawing. That strategy had killed thousands of American airmen. But from early 1944, the rule suddenly collapsed. German pilots returned confused and angry, reporting P-47s still circling bomber formations when they attacked, even pursuing Luftwaffe planes during withdrawal. A Jagdgeschwader 26 report stated, "Fighter cover remains over Magdeburg and Leipzig beyond normal endurance limits." Some technical officers thought the Americans had new engines or higher energy fuel, but no one had a sure answer. On the ground, anxiety spread across German airfields. Veteran pilots who once mocked the heavy Thunderbolt now faced a different reality. The Iron Pig could fly twice as far as before. Adolf Galland, Germany's top ace who had ordered attack when escorts turned back, wrote in his tactical diary, "They changed the range equation, one short line, but enough to signal a turning point. In training sessions, commanders warned, don't engage P-47 near targets. Their endurance is unpredictable. Some units shifted to long-range ambushes, but they were no longer effective. Thunderbolts and new Mustangs with auxiliary tanks now appeared everywhere from Brunswick to Hanover. They didn't just protect B-17s, they chased retreating German planes." On Luftwaffe radio frequencies, seasoned pilots heard something new: American guns pursuing them all the way to the border. A German pilot who survived Leipzig said in a post-war interview, "They never used to follow us home, now they do." In weeks, the air over Germany transformed completely. The Germans, accustomed to attacking from the initiative, now became prey. P-47 formations flew high, ready to dive on any German fighter trying to escape. Reports from the 11th Air Fleet admitted increasing losses of unknown cause. No one understood why American pilots could suddenly fly so far. No one saw the handmade drop tanks falling from the sky. No one suspected those metal scraps were collapsing the Luftwaffe's entire air doctrine. In 1 month, German Air Force loss rates doubled. Numbers that once favored them now reversed. The air war had warped from the hunter's advantage to the terror of the hunted. In February 1944, as winter laid a thin sheet of ice over Debden's runways, a technical report from Wright Field, Ohio, unexpectedly shook Air Force Command. During routine inspection, engineers discovered strange welds and non-standard copper lines on a P-47 returned from Europe. Those marks weren't in any Republic aviation blueprint. The report opened with a dry sentence: "Unrecorded modifications to aircraft fuel system detected." As the investigation widened, they were stunned to find nearly every squadron at Debden, Duxford, and parts of the 8th Fighter Command had independently modified fuel systems, installing wing-mounted auxiliary tanks without official approval. Urgent recall orders were sent to England. In Debden's briefing room, commanding officers stood around the table, faces cold as steel. Who authorized this? No one answered. They just looked at each other. The statistical report on the projector screen was clear. In the past 2 months, bomber losses dropped 40%, mission completion rates doubled, and returning pilot survival was the highest since the war began. Those numbers made every accusation half-hearted. But in the military, rules were rules. Rules was called for interrogation. The senior officer slammed his hand on the table. "You violated procedure, Lieutenant. You conducted unauthorized flight tests, falsified maintenance logs, and risked Air Corps property." Reaves replied calmly, "So did the enemy, sir." The room went dead silent. The interrogator stared at him for a long moment, then closed the file without another word. At the table's end, a young officer flipped to the latest stats. Squadrons with auxiliary tanks now had a 1.31 kill ratio. The first time in air war history the U.S. shot down more German planes than it lost. The numbers spoke for the defense. While committees debated punishment or reward, Wright Field quietly ordered official testing of the field drop tank system created by Debden pilots. Test results showed safe, effective, doubled range without combat performance loss. An engineer noted, "System works flawlessly. Field innovation should be reviewed for standardization." In March 1944, the U.S. Air Force issued Directive AC-154-2, officially approving drop tanks as standard for all P-47 and P-51 fighters. The bulletin mentioned no names, only adopted following field innovation reports from 8th Air Force, England. At Debden, Reaves was ordered back to his squadron. No medals, no thanks, just a new assignment sheet. As he walked into the hangar, everyone stopped work, looked at him silently, then laughed and patted his shoulder. "Berlin Express still flies," someone said. Phelps wasn't there. He had been transferred to logistics, the file citing administrative reassignment. But Reaves knew the truth. Phelps was moved to bury the incident, prevent precedent. On his last night before leaving Debden, Phelps stopped by the hangar, looking at Reeves's P-47, now fitted with a shiny factory-made auxiliary tank. On the tank side, the hand-etched words remained, "Stupid idea, but it worked." He touched them lightly and smiled. It was over, at least on paper. But out there, over Europe's skies, Hundreds of P-47s and P-51s were taking off, carrying that same stupid idea once hidden in the dark. As engines roared across the base, Reaves looked up, knowing he had won, not with titles or medals, but with men still alive to fly home. In April 1944, Europe's skies blazed with white smoke trails from hundreds of B-17 flying fortresses flying east, and for the first time in history, they were no longer alone. Flanking the formation, long lines of P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs flew parallel, escorting the bombers from England to Berlin and back safely. Each carried sleek auxiliary fuel tanks under the wings, symbols of a new era in air warfare. Those who once called it a stupid idea now looked up in silence as range limits were erased. In the next 3 months, the Luftwaffe suffered its heaviest losses of the war, 56% of its force destroyed, thousands of veteran German pilots never returning. German fighter formations that once ruled the Reich's skies were now hunted over their own homeland. American papers wrote with pride, new external fuel tanks increase escort range, Allied bombers now reach Berlin with fighter cover. The headline dominated front pages, but no one mentioned Jack Reaves or Alan Phelps. No thanks, no ceremony, just numbers, reports and articles praising U.S. Air Force technical progress. At Debden, Reaves kept flying, now squadron leader. He led missions through the Ruhr, Frankfurt, and finally Berlin. On every flight, glancing at the silver tank under his wing, he remembered the cold night in the hangar, the sound of welding sparks and burning oil when they built it first. Elsewhere, Phelps worked in a logistics office, signing off on thousands of drop tank standardized model requisitions. He knew every bolt, every weld traced back to his and Reeves's scribbled sketch, but he never said it. One afternoon, when the radio announced, Fighter Escort now ensures 90% bomber survival rate, he turned it off, leaned back, and smiled. He didn't need recognition, just those planes coming home was enough. The war continued until Germany fell. Drop tanks became standard on every fighter from Thunderbolt, Mustang to Lightning. After the war, they were called an inevitable technical turning point. No one remembering it began with a defiant night in a hangar. In 1991, during renovations at the Dayton Air Force Museum, technicians found an old dented aluminum auxiliary tank in storage. On its side, beneath faded paint, hand-etched letters nearly worn away read, "To hell with range limits, Jr. Deck 1943. No one knew who Jr. was, but the curator had it polished and placed in the Innovations of War exhibit. The small plaque beneath read simply, Field Modified Fuel Tank, P-47 Thunderbolt, 1943. No name, no rank, just a silent testament to courage. In the archival footage playing nearby, the narrator's warm voice rose like history's farewell. Sometimes, saving a war doesn't take a new airplane, just the courage to hang one more tank under its wing. Light in the exhibit hall shone through the dented aluminum, casting a faint halo on the wall behind. In that glow, one could almost see the reflection of two men, a pilot and an engineer who dared break limits to bring thousands of lives home. No more engine roar, no welding sparks, just the soft light of old metal. And in that silence, one could almost hear the distant echo of an era where one small, stupid, defiant idea helped bring the world closer to freedom. Thank you for following this story, where ordinary men changed history with courage and ingenuity. Subscribe to the channel to explore more forgotten war stories with us, and meet again on the next journey.